In our headlines on this Tuesday, April 7th, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung hosts the leaders of the country's rival political parties for trilateral talks aimed at addressing the escalating cost of living for Koreans amid the unrest in the Middle East. And speaking of that unrest, U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday claims Iran can be, quote, taken out in one night, and that night might be Tuesday night if Tehran fails to seal a deal that is, quote, acceptable to him. Back on the local front, Samsung Electronics is projecting an operating profit of over 57 trillion won, or roughly $38 billion for the first quarter of this year, driven by strong demand for artificial intelligence chips. As we count down fewer than 24 hours to his deadline on Tehran, U.S. President Donald Trump has reaffirmed his resolve to unleash havoc on critical infrastructure in Iran should the country fail to ensure safe transit to all vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. He also singled out American allies, including South Korea, for their alleged lack of support. Our Kim Jun-hong has the latest.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday issued an ultimatum to Iran, saying all power plants and bridges would be destroyed unless the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, and the deal aimed at ending the 5-week conflict is agreed. Speaking to reporters at the White House on Monday, Trump said he was not at all concerned that such action could amount to war crimes, and that he had already given Tehran enough extensions, and the Tuesday 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time deadline is final.
But we're giving them till tomorrow, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and after that, they're going to have no bridges, they're going to have no power plants.
Trump went on to say that total destruction would be carried out by midnight, and that Iran must accept the deal he deems acceptable, reiterating that reopening the Strait of Hormuz remains his top priority in any agreement with Tehran. The U.S. president also criticized European and Asian allies for failing to support Washington in its conflict with Iran, specifically naming South Korea. Repeating his description of NATO as a, quote, paper tiger, he said the alliance had offered little support in the war.
And it's not just NATO. You know who else didn't help us? South Korea didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Australia didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Japan.
He wrapped up his press conference with renewed frustration over the lack of response to last month's call for naval deployments to the Strait of Hormuz. Trump pointed to what he said is 45,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, though the actual figure is closer to 28,000. He stressed that their deployment was to offer protection against nuclear-armed North Korea. Kim Jun-hong, Arirang News.
Iran, meanwhile, has dismissed a proposal by Pakistan for a temporary truce, demanding instead for a permanent end to the military confrontation, among other conditions. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
Iran has rejected a 45-day temporary ceasefire plan delivered to both Washington and Tehran by regional intermediaries, calling instead for a permanent end to the conflict. According to Iran's state news agency IRNA on Monday, Tehran has instead submitted a 10-point response via Pakistan, rejecting a temporary ceasefire and outlining demands including an end to regional conflicts, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, reconstruction of war-damaged areas, and the lifting of international sanctions. U.S. President Donald Trump described Iran's proposal as a significant step, but said it was not good enough, warning of sweeping strikes on Iranian infrastructure if no deal is reached. Iran on Monday dismissed the threats as baseless.
The rude rhetoric, arrogance and baseless threats of the delusional U.S. president arising from the deadlock he faces and aimed at justifying the repeated defeats of the U.S. military will have no effect on the continuation of offensive and crushing operations by the fighters of Islam against U.S. and Israeli enemies.
The exchange follows reports that Washington sent a 15-point peace plan proposal through Pakistan in late March, which Iran rejected as unrealistic and disconnected from battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, tensions escalated on the ground. Iran confirmed the death of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' intelligence chief, Majid Kademi, in an overnight strike blamed on U.S. and Israeli forces. Israel later confirmed responsibility, with Defense Minister Israel Katz calling Kademi a top commander responsible for war crimes. The Israel Defense Forces said he was among the IRGC's most senior figures, underscoring a widening conflict with no clear path to de-escalation. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Here on the local front, President Lee Jae-myung has called on rival political parties to put aside their differences as South Korea seeks to protect the livelihoods of people here from the costly consequences of the conflict in the Middle East. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min has more.
The three-way meeting began with handshakes. President Lee Jae-myung, wearing a tie representing unity, called for across-the-aisle cooperation as he hosted the leaders of the nation's two main political parties over lunch, stressing the importance of communication.
우리 공동체가 위기에 처해 있을 때는 내부적 단합이 정말로 중요합니다. 우리가 통상적으로 얘기하는 것처럼 통합이라고 하는 것이 정말 이럴 때 빛을 발하지 않을까 싶습니다.
Higher living costs topped Tuesday's meeting as the country navigates the fallout from the war in the Middle East. Lee said he expects dialogue and coordination across the aisle for the war response supplementary budget worth 26 trillion won or $17 billion, which includes cash assistance for the bottom 70% of the income bracket.
근데 이런 거는 뭐 현찰 나눠주기라고 하는 것은 좀 과한 표현이라는 생각이 들어요. 지금 유류대 인상 또 그로 인해 파생되는 물가 상승이 워낙 크기 때문에 그로 인한 고통을 조금이라도 우리가 보전해 드려야 된다는 생각을 가지고 있습니다.
As the president reiterated that the government's extra budget was organized with surplus tax revenues, the ruling Democratic Party leader Chung Cheong-nae asked for support for its swift approval.
We should not miss this critical point for people's livelihoods. If it gets delayed, the damage will be greater. I have repeatedly promised to pass the extra budget as quickly as possible. I ask for cooperation from the opposition.
But the main opposition People Power Party leader Chang Dong-hyuk disagreed with certain spending plans.
Our party plans to cut unnecessary and inadequate spending. Instead, we have proposed 7 items that are seen as essential for people to survive. I hope these are reflected in the budget. I believe that will be the start of cooperation.
Chang was also critical of the government's policies in a host of areas, ranging from the economy, real estate to foreign policy, and asked that the president change his course of state affairs.
다소 불편한 말씀을 길게 드렸지만 들어주셔서 감사합니다.
전혀 안 불편합니다.
The meeting took place at a time when politicians are standing apart on certain issues, such as a special probe into what the DP calls politically motivated indictments under the previous conservative administration. The three-way meeting was the first of its kind in about 7 months, as a scheduled lunch meeting in February was abruptly canceled as the PPP leader protested the DP-led judicial reform laws. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, over at the Parliament, the Special Committee on Budget and Accounts convened on this Tuesday for the first of a 2-day Q&A session on the government's proposal for a supplementary budget of over 26 trillion won to weather the broader economic consequences of the conflict in the Middle East. The ruling Democratic Party called the proposal urgently necessary, while the main opposition People Power Party referred to parts of the proposal as vote buying ahead of the local elections this June. Budget Minister Park Hong-gun, for his part, urged for prompt action, warning that delays would only aggravate hardships. A subcommittee review is set for Thursday and a full floor vote is scheduled for Friday. And the price of petrol at the pumps here in Seoul has surpassed 2,000 won per litre, prompting a stricter campaign to save energy on the roads. Our Cha Yun-kyung explains.
The average price of gasoline in Seoul has surpassed 2,000 won, or $1.32 per liter, due to the effects of the ongoing war in the Middle East. According to OPNet, a fuel price monitoring system operated by the state-run Korea National Oil Corporation, the average stood at 2,001.54 won per liter as of 2:30 p.m. Tuesday, up 11.15 won from the previous day. It's the first time in 3 years and 8 months that the per-liter price has exceeded 2,000 won when prices surged due to the Russia-Ukraine war. Nationwide, the average price has risen 8.54 won per liter, standing at 1,966.91 won. The South Korean government will implement a 5-day rotation system at public parking lots starting Wednesday. Entry is restricted on one day of the week based on the last digit of a car's license plate number, but it does not apply on weekends and public holidays. This is in line with government guidance following the issuance of a resource security crisis alert at the caution level as global supply disruptions continue. Public institutions that were already adopting the 5-day rotation system will be tightened further. Cars with odd-numbered plates will be allowed to operate on odd-numbered dates, while even-numbered plates will run on even-numbered dates. Electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles will be excluded, along with vehicles carrying people with disabilities or pregnant women. Violations will be subject to a 3-strike rule, with disciplinary action imposed after 3 or more violations. Cha Yoon-kyung, Arirang News.
And as expected, analysts at the state-run KDI believe the South Korean economy is now exposed to greater external risk factors given the unrest in the Middle East. Our Ian Jin covers their most recent assessment.
South Korea's economy had been showing a trend of modest recovery until it was disrupted by the ongoing Middle East war and now faces increased downside risks. This was the assessment by the Korea Development Institute in its April publication. The KDI's analysis suggests that as soaring international oil prices and supply chain instability persist, negative impacts on inflation, consumption, investment, and exports across the board could intensify. The state-run think tank first mentioned the possibility of downward economic risks from the geopolitical crisis 1 month ago and is now issuing a more explicit warning, saying the risks are expanding. Domestic demand is currently improving modestly, while exports maintain a high growth rate on the back of strong demand for semiconductors. Average retail sales for January and February increased by 2.7% compared to the same period last year, recording a higher growth rate than in December of last year, which was at 1.2%. Service industry production also increased by 3.3% during the same period. Facility investment rose by 9.3% in January and February on average, bolstered by strong investment in semiconductors. And while construction investment remains sluggish, the decline showed signs of easing. However, the KDI also analyzed that as of March, downward risks to the economy are expanding due to rising oil prices and global supply chain instability due to the Middle East war. For the month of March, the spike in prices at gas stations drove consumer prices up 2.2%, slightly higher than the 2% in February. While inflation remains close to the 2% target, the KDI warned that upward pressure could build further as the impact of rising oil prices is gradually reflected in inflation, which may act as a negative factor for future consumption. Exports are also at risk of facing worsening conditions amid a potential slowdown in external demand due to the Middle East war. Yoon-jin, Arirang News.
In the meantime, however, Samsung Electronics is marking a new milestone with its earnings for the first quarter of this year sharply surpassing expectations as global demand for AI chips outweigh fears over the economic fallout of the unrest in the Middle East. Our Lee Soo-jin reports.
Samsung Electronics' first quarter profit beat its total for all of last year. The company announced quarter one profits of 57.2 trillion Korean won, or approximately $37.9 billion. This sets a new record for the highest quarterly operating profit in the company's history. According to the company's preliminary earnings report released Tuesday, the operating profit is a 755% surge compared to the same period in 2025. Sales reached 133 trillion won, or roughly $88.1 billion. That represents a 68% increase on year. This follows a record-breaking fourth quarter of 2025, which saw 20.1 trillion won in profit. With just the first quarter results of 2026, Samsung is already nearing its highest ever annual operating profit of 58.89 trillion won recorded during the semiconductor supercycle in 2018. While market analysis had widely expected a strong performance, the record-breaking figures even outpaced initial forecasts. This historic performance is underpinned by a semiconductor superboom. The primary driver is the explosive global demand for AI computing, which caused DRAM and NAND prices to surge by approximately 90% compared to the previous quarter. Securities analysis estimate that the semiconductor division's operating profit alone exceeded 50 trillion won, essentially driving the entire company's earnings. Specifically, they estimate that DRAM alone recorded over 41 trillion won in operating profit. Samsung's mobile and smartphone divisions also contribute to the bottom line, bolstered by the recent launch of Samsung's flagship AI-integrated handset series earlier this year. The finalized and fully audited financial results, including specific divisional performances, will be disclosed later this month following board approval. 이수진, Arirang News.
Now, while we await that disclosure, our economics correspondent Kim Do-yeon reached out to pundits for their thoughts on Samsung's latest performance and the prospects ahead. To take a listen.
Samsung Electronics' record-breaking first-quarter performance has propelled the company into the global top 5 for tech sector profits, which includes Apple, Microsoft, and Alphabet. With memory chip prices climbing and sales heavily booked following February's rollout of next-generation HBM4 chips, financial experts are revising annual forecasts upward.
We also expect memory semiconductor prices to continue rising significantly in the second quarter, so this year's expected operating profit will likely exceed our previous estimates by a wide margin. We had projected an operating profit of around 240 trillion won, but we now expect it to reach even higher. I can tell you that the valuation merit is quite substantial.
The structural demand for AI infrastructure remains robust. Recently, the emergence of highly efficient software technologies such as TurboQuant sparked market concerns that major memory chip makers like Samsung and SK Hynix might struggle as overall hardware requirements decrease. However, experts note that this efficiency actually accelerates broader market expansion.
To summarize, software technologies that utilize less memory, such as Google's, allow software companies to use less memory while accelerating the growth of their inference business. This has the effect of allowing more companies to enter the market. Consequently, that means even more memory will be needed.
While the demand outlook remains exceptionally strong, the industry is also closely monitoring external geopolitical risks. However, Middle East tensions currently pose minimal threat to immediate operations despite the sector's reliance on regional materials like helium and LNG. Domestic chip makers have secured a 6-month stockpile, meaning broader macroeconomic fallout would be a much greater concern than chip production if Operation Epic Fury prolongs.
If the situation prolongs, semiconductor production itself won't be the issue. Rather, all industries that demand semiconductors will experience considerable difficulties. In that scenario, even if we manufacture the chips, there may be nowhere to sell them.
Furthermore, the weakened Korean won against the US dollar continues to bolster Samsung's earnings, providing a highly favorable environment for major exporters. With this currency trend expected to persist, the company's profitability is positioned for further growth. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news now, NASA's Artemis II astronauts have made history by setting a new distance record for traveling further from Earth than anyone before. Our Cho Young-eun covers that event.
Breaking into tears and hugging one another, the 4 astronauts marked the moment they set a new record for the farthest human spaceflight. On Monday, the Artemis II crew traveled 248,655 miles from Earth. surpassing the previous record set by Apollo 13 in 1970. Moments after the milestone, they proposed names for two lunar craters, Integrity after their Orion capsule, and Carol in honor of Commander Reed Wiseman's late wife. The Orion spacecraft launched successfully on April 1st from Kennedy Space Center in Florida aboard the Space Launch System rocket beginning its journey around the moon. As the astronauts became the first humans to view parts of the moon's far side in person, the crew temporarily lost contact with mission control during a planned 40-minute signal blackout while orbiting behind the moon. Contact was later restored and the crew went on to observe a solar eclipse.
So you'd been transported to the far side of the moon, and it really just bent your mind. It was an extraordinary human experience.
As Canadian astronaut Jeremy Henson confirmed that the crew had traveled farther than any humans in history, he also emphasized that the milestone should inspire future generations to make sure this record is not long-lived. At its farthest point, the spacecraft is expected to reach approximately 252,756 miles from Earth before returning home. As it passes the moon, the spacecraft measured within about 4,067 miles of the lunar surface. Now more than halfway through their 10-day mission, the crew is scheduled to splash down off the coast of San Diego on Friday, April 10. 조영은, 아리랑 뉴스.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. Russian drones struck Ukraine's Black Sea port city of Odesa overnight on Monday, killing a 30-year-old mother, her 2-year-old daughter, and one other woman. Residential buildings, energy infrastructure, and a kindergarten were damaged in the attack. Odesa's regional governor said 16 people sustained injuries, including a pregnant woman and 2 small children. Around 16,700 households across several districts lost power, with the energy company saying repairs would take significant time. President Vladimir Zelensky said Russia launched 140 drones at Ukraine in overnight attacks, also striking energy infrastructure across the Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipro regions. Over the past week alone, Russia has attacked Ukraine with more than 2,800 attack drones, nearly 1,350 guided aerial bombs, and over 40 missiles. Zelensky renewed his call for additional air defense systems, saying Russia has no intention of stopping. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday handed Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon a significant legal victory, issuing an order that opens the door to the dismissal of his criminal contempt of Congress conviction. The justices set aside an appeals court decision that had kept Bannon's 2022 conviction intact, and with that appeal ruling now thrown out, a federal trial judge can proceed with the Trump administration's pending request to drop the case entirely. Bannon has already completed a 4-month prison term following his conviction for defying a subpoena from the House committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack. The Justice Department, which pursued the case under the Biden administration, abandoned its defense of the conviction after Trump took office for a second term. The head of the International Monetary Fund said on Monday that the war in the Middle East is set to push inflation higher and slow global growth, warning that even a swift end to hostilities will not prevent a downgrade to the IMF's economic outlook. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the conflict has reduced global oil supply by 13%, disrupting energy shipments and supply chains from helium to fertilizers. She said the deeper and longer the war runs, the greater the damage to growth and prices worldwide. The IMF releases its full world economic outlook on April 14th, where the war is expected to dominate discussions among global finance officials. Chu Ji-han, Arirang News.
Temperatures dropped quite a bit this morning, bringing a late-season cold snap. Tomorrow in Seoul, it'll fall to around 3 degrees Celsius. And it'll stay chilly in the morning through tomorrow and on Wednesday. So make sure to bring a jacket when heading out. Meanwhile, air quality will be pretty good nationwide because of better air quality. In parts of the central and western regions, dust levels could tick up a bit in the morning and again at night as the air gets a little stagnant. But things should clear out in the afternoon. Tomorrow, we'll see large day-to-night temperature swings. Seoul will start the day at 3 degrees Celsius, Chuncheon at 0 degrees, Daegu at 1 degree. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 15 degrees, Chuncheon at 16 degrees, Busan at 15 degrees. Looking ahead, we've got more rain on the way from Thursday into Friday. It could be quite heavy at times, especially along the southern coast, around Jirishan Mountain and on Jeju Island. Once the rain clears, it'll warm up again. But with these ups and downs in the weather, make sure to take care of yourself. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session, so do stay with us and thank you for now.
I heard that 2026 is a special year for Arirang TV as it will mark its 30th anniversary. So I would like to congratulate Arirang TV and all the teams on this occasion. Also would like to say that Arirang TV is important for Belgian viewers because this is a channel that allows them to listen to stories and to hear what is happening in Korea. And I think that such international broadcasting are crucial for people to communicate and understand each other better. So again, I wish to congratulate Arirang TV, and I wish that it will definitely goes on with the broadcasting in Belgium, and so helping our people to understand each other better.
저는 만 5살에 바이올린을 시작했는데요. 바이올린 소리를 워낙 좋아했어서 그 특유의 따뜻함과 약간 사람의 목소리 같은 목소리를 갖고 있거든요, 바이올린이. 저는 무대에 올랐을 때보다는 이제 혼자 연습할 때 더 큰 희열을 느끼는데, 제가 표현하고자 하는 음악이 잘 나왔을 때 그때 가장 큰 기쁨을 느끼는 것 같아요. 그래서 저만의 색깔을 어떻게 하면 찾아갈 수 있을까, 그걸 제일 많이 고민하는 것 같아요. 아무래도 연습을 할 때는 이제 생각과 고민을 많이 하는 반면에 무대에서 연주할 때는 정말 머릿속을 비우고 아무 생각도 안 하려고 하는 것 같아요. 무대에서는 자유롭게 콩쿨 무대도 저만의 독주라고 생각하는 자세를 가지려고 하고 있어요. 사실 바이올린과는 거의 제 인생의 대부분을 같이 해왔기 때문에 저를 힘들게 할 때도 많지만 제가 가장 사랑하고 아끼는 존재입니다. 작곡가가 전달하고 싶은 메시지와 또 제 자신이 관객들에게 전달하고 싶은 메시지를 모두 다 설득력 있게 잘 전달할 수 있는 그런 연주자가 되고 싶습니다.
held its first debate over the weekend.
The economy is expected to expand 2.5% this year.
Boosting Korea's ties with its global partners on the sidelines of the Status UN summit.
A massive drone attack on Ukraine overnight on Monday and Tuesday.
Arirang.
Asia is adopting a host of measures to save energy amid supply disruptions owing to tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. We cover this campaign and more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective for April 7th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The conflict in the Middle East has triggered energy-saving campaigns here in South Korea and in other Asian countries. For more on this reality, I have independent journalist Kelly Silis-Jo here in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Thanks for having me once again.
I also have Jin Mangaluz with Philstar.com joining this session virtually. Jin, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
I'm happy to be back. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. Kelly, before we explore the efforts underway by countries to here and, of course, elsewhere to cut fuel consumption amid disruptions in oil supplies, perhaps we can get a wrap-up, perhaps, of the latest developments with regard to the Trump administration's military operation against Iran.
Tensions are very high right now, and things look like they're getting quite serious. For those who haven't seen, U.S. President Trump has made some really, really bold threats very publicly in a way that has sent much of the world into a tizzy. Whether it's bluster or not, these kinds of words coming from a U.S. president are quite severe. So what he said was he gave Iran a deadline of Tuesday night to open up the Strait of Hormuz, and he said, quote, "The entire country can be taken out in one night." And then he said that night could be tomorrow night, meaning Tuesday night. So that's a really, really severe threat. It almost alludes perhaps to the use of nuclear weapons. He said that the U.S. has a plan to blow up every bridge, every major power center. And of course, there's been a lot of outcry from, foreign nations, human rights groups saying that a plan like that would certainly be a violation of international law. It would impact, if not kill, civilians. And then on the other side of things, there are people saying that he's kind of just doing what he did with North Korea, where he threatens to rain fire and fury. But ultimately, he's hoping that this is back in 2017, 2018, but he's hoping that that might push Iran to the table. But Still, those words are quite irresponsible to throw around if that's the case. He has said that he's open to solving this diplomatically, whatever that means. And Iran, for its part, has said that it has submitted a 10-point resolution plan towards peace to the United States. But of course, it's being reported that this plan, some of those points are things that the U.S. has conveyed that it's not willing to negotiate on at all and would never agree to. So we're looking at a situation where, you know, a date and a time and a really destructive threat has been made, and we're all kind of just hoping that nothing bad happens and that, you know, we can temper down the tensions a little bit, because I wouldn't say this is unprecedented maybe, but it's quite severe.
Right, it is severe. And in the meantime, though, countries, especially here in Asia, are trying to deal with the ripple effects of the tensions in the Middle East. That being said, Jean, I understand the Philippines declared a national energy emergency in late March. Could you tell us a bit more about that particular declaration and its broader implications?
Yeah, I think the order definitely highlights how precarious the energy situation in the Philippines is, especially with how dependent we are on imported petrol products, especially diesel. The Philippine economy heavily runs on diesel. But if you read between the lines of President Marcos's order, it doesn't actually grant the government any sort of extraordinary powers to act beyond what it can normally do. Some local critics have said that the order is a bit vague in terms of wording. So, for example, President Marcos's order doesn't actually enforce a price cap on fuel prices right now. So the country, and that's because the country actually deregulated the oil industry back in the 90s. So with every external shock in the Middle East, the government has very limited powers in terms of how to control prices in the Philippines. So the president has explained that this order is mainly to make sure that all of the options are on the table for the Philippines, and at the very least that there's some level of harmonization in terms of government efforts to mitigate the crisis. And of course, I think the order will also have the typical energy-saving measures of work from home arrangement and trimming down of excess spending.
Right, with regard to energy, of course. Kelly, for the sake of comparison, do tell us a bit about South Korea's own campaign to save energy.
Yeah, South Korea has announced an energy-saving plan, if you will. Much of it is actually more like encouraging the public to reduce their energy consumption rather than rationing or restricting energy use, as we're seeing in some other countries. So the Korean government has, suggested that this is becoming a real concern for South Korea and its energy reserves. It's encouraged people to, shorten the time that they use taking a shower, not charge their electric vehicles at night if they're not empty, things like that. Whether or not the populace is really complying, I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't think that the energy crisis is necessarily being felt acutely here yet. Certainly not like what you're seeing on social media in Vietnam, where people are trying to fill, the gas tanks of their motorbikes and being told they can only pay for 50% of a tank or something like that. But I mean, it's a major concern. Korea is an export-driven economy, an economy that's not doing that well right now, and much of its industry in terms of exports are the kind of things that require a ton of energy. It's almost completely reliant on imports when it comes to, oil, gas, and I think 70% of its crude oil supply is also imported, and much of that comes from the Middle East. So what we're seeing right now is what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it not only threatens Korea's economy, but it threatens its economy at a time where the Korean won is very, very weak against the US dollar, the British pound, the euro. I think it's the weakest against the dollar it's been since the 1998 financial crisis. And that's actually gotten worse since that was in the news, right? It's really severe right now. And, it's hard to feel it because we don't obviously have any conflicts happening here. There's no rationing going on yet. But just looking at how high tech and dense Seoul is, I mean, I think what Korea is trying to do is really avert a crisis where millions of people have their lives affected by this overnight.
Avert a crisis, of course, by taking preemptive measures. Jean, how is the broader fallout of the unrest in the Middle East perhaps affecting the ordinary people in the Philippines?
we immediately feel the effects in the Philippines. So 98% of the country's fuel is imported. Oil prices have more than doubled since from where they were in February, and it's quite a shock to the system. Our transport sector, of course, was the first one hit. Some of our jeepney drivers, some of our bus drivers, they no longer find it viable to fly routes because it's so expensive now. And actually, our inflation rate just came out today, so it soared from 2% in February up to 4% now in March, and all because of the oil crisis. And again, because we're such an oil-dependent country, everything else is affected. So even the food prices have started to increase in the Philippines. For example, our rice inflation was in the negatives for like 14 months. So the price of rice is decreasing steadily, and now it's just surged back up to 3 point something percent. So this may weaken the average Filipino household's purchasing power. And our own economic department has foreseen that this may also have an eventual impact on the country's GDP, our poverty rate, and our employment rate as well.
Right. Kelly, here in South Korea, rampant fears over plastic shortages have led to panic buying. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Right. It's funny. Before it was being reported that plastic bags, that we were facing a shortage, I actually experienced it and didn't know what that was coming from. So for those who are not living in Korea, the way that the government's trash system works is you have to buy government plastic trash bags and throw your trash away in that, because that kind of helps pay for the system that takes care of this mega city of Seoul and the rest of the country. In the United States, it's not like that at all. But it's very important also because Korea is a small country. We can't be burning our trash on high levels. The waste system needs to be managed very well already. There are air quality problems because of this. So anyway, a couple weeks ago, right around the beginning of this war, I ran out of trash bags, and I like to follow the law. So I went to 3 or 4 stores looking for them, and the first one I went to, I said, "Do you have any trash bags?" And the guy laughed at me and he said, "No, and good luck." And I had no idea where that was coming from. And I even checked my local Juman center and they didn't have any at the time. So what you're seeing is a lot of people, when they can acquire these bags, and there's plenty of TikToks and Instagram reels of people kind of sharing their journey looking for these trash bags. You have people panic buying them. You have stores rationing them out, saying that one customer can't take too many. You have people trying to sell them for inflated prices on secondhand markets. There are some nice stories of neighbors helping each other out as well. But the reason why this is a story really is because it exposes how weak or how vulnerable the global supply chain is over plastics, particularly in Korea. I mean, this conflict that's going on in the Middle East, I mean, South Korea had almost no say in it. But as a major U.S. ally, I mean, their hands are kind of tied in it. And now they're having a major supply chain issue. At the same time, beyond the trash bags specifically, I do think this might be a good opportunity for Korea to tackle a problem that it's had for many years, at least the 10 years that I've been here, which is Korea is the most prolific user of single-use plastics in the world. Its air quality is very bad. Some studies have shown that 30+ people die every day directly related to the fine dust pollution during the high season. It's the way that we've had problems, shipping trash to Thailand and other countries to have it burned, and then those countries saying that they no longer want to do that for South Korea. I mean, this is a real issue. So I do think when people are talking about conserving on electricity, I think it's time that we also consider using reusable materials. And just to explain the science of this, I'm not a material scientist, but I guess the way that this works is in the petrochemical industry, there's a component called polyethylene that's used in these single-use plastics, and that is made from refining naphtha, which is made from refining crude oil. So when 70% of the crude oil is imported from the Middle East, I mean, there you have the supply chain crisis.
Right, hence the shortage or the fears of the potential shortage of plastic garbage bin bags here in the country. Meanwhile, Jean, the Philippines, it's reportedly secured an arrangement for safe passage of its vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular arrangement?
Yes, this is definitely a good news for us. It's a diplomatic win, especially for a country that's that has treaty ties with the U.S. I think it's a result of consistent independent foreign policy. The Energy Secretary said that this deal with Iran prevents a worst case scenario for the Philippines, which is energy disruptions and complete depletion. However, it's been emphasized that it's not a perfect solution. While it's safer for Philippine-flagged vessels to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, the cargo that they bring is still very expensive. And since the majority of our oil is still imported, our prices are still tied to global fuel costs. So even days after the deal with Iran was announced, gas prices still went up for the Philippines.
Right, I see. South Korea, meanwhile, Kelly, recently refuted reports that it was mulling over potentially paying Iran a transit toll for the use of the Strait of Hormuz. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so the statement coming out of the Blue House was in direct response to a South Korean media report citing anonymous sources, essentially contesting that the Korean government is considering or having internal talks about paying Iran toll fees, if you will, or fees for the safe passage of Korean vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Blue House, through its spokesperson, has told Reuters that that is absolutely not true. They're not considering it at all, that they weren't considering it. Why is this important? You know, South Korea, like many other nations, has been dragged into what is now becoming a very serious war with potentially very serious high stakes, and it has virtually no say in it so far. President Trump has put a lot of pressure on its allies and even its adversaries like China to join in on the U.S.'s side with this conflict that it almost unilaterally waged alongside Israel, and has made a lot of chiding remarks about we don't need your support, but I'm paying attention, I'm keeping record of who's offering military assets and things like that. So from the standpoint of at least the Trump administration, right, South Korea doesn't look very good. It has been very tactful in remaining quiet on this matter and trying to stay as uninvolved as possible. And as we talked about in the previous questions, it's still being affected in terms of the global supply chain and energy. And so to me, what this looks like is the Blue House telegraphing essentially that for the record, they are not going to comply with this situation that has been set up where Iran is essentially, threatening blowing up or attacking ships that could be passing through the Strait of Hormuz that it sees as adversarial or U.S. allies, and that it is kind of taking a back seat and not, literally providing funds to a sanctioned nation by the United States.
Right. Jean, with regard to diplomatic wins by the Philippines, I understand the country recently received barrels of diesel from Japan. Do tell us more about that.
Yes, the Philippines has been holding a lot of government-to-government talks with different countries apart from Japan. The government is also in talks with oil-producing countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia, which is part of the ASEAN. But we've also entered talks with non-traditional trade partners such as India, Argentina, Colombia, and Canada. So the government seems intent on diversifying where we can source our oil. Recently, we also received oil shipments from Russia, which is the first time that happened in years. So our president has also expressed willingness to have joint operations with Russia in the disputed, with China, sorry, in the disputed West Philippines Sea. So considering how tense our confrontations are with Beijing, this really underscores the gravity of the situation.
Right. South Korea, meanwhile, Kelly, for its part, continues to seek support from the Gulf nations, right?
Yes. So since at least President Moon Jae-in's administration, at this point, almost 10 years ago, South Korea has really tried to improve relations with Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. Some of this has to do with the exact thing we're talking about, the energy supply chain. But also, Korea being an export-driven economy, it really stands to benefit from being partners with these wealthy, oil-rich nations on other fronts. For instance, there's a major medical partnership between South Korea and Saudi Arabia or Qatar. So anyway, on Friday, South Korea's finance ministry met with the Gulf Cooperation Council. So this is a team of countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. And essentially, Korea was trying to cash in and bear the fruits of its labor in those years of diplomacy by saying, hey, listen, can you help us ensure that our ships will be able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz safely? And will you support us us in our oil and our energy supply chain? Will you help put us on the priority list, if you will, of countries that you will export to? Because we really don't want to be in a desperate situation like we're seeing in other parts of Asia. And so, obviously they heard some, positive, reconciliatory, happy responses, but it stands to be seen how exactly that meeting will literally translate into something tangible. But it's another example of, Korea kind of expanding and trying to warm its partnerships, if you will, with nations beyond the United States and Europe. And in this case, it seems really essential that that partnership continues to grow.
Right. Jean, in the meantime, what else is being done at different levels of the society there, of course, to navigate the domestic challenges set off by the conflict in the Middle East?
Right now, there's a lot of talk about suspending several types of taxes to ease pump prices. So President Marcos has asked Congress to grant him powers to suspend the excise tax on fuel products. But fuel costs are so high right now that it would barely make a dent. So they are discussing the removal of the value-added tax on fuel prices. Now there are also talks to return control of the fuel industry back to the government, because like I mentioned earlier, it's currently deregulated right now. So several members of Congress actually want to grant the government back, grant regulatory powers back to the government. So that's some of the measures. Of course, there are also more immediate measures that they're trying to do. Like if you go to a government office past a certain time, the lights will be off, the air con's going to be off. So those are some of the more immediate responses that they have.
Right, taken by different entities to ensure that this particular crisis does not hurt their people too much, of course. I'm afraid that's all the time we have right now. Jean, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching and see you back here same time tomorrow.